That night, under the crystal dome of the glasshouse pavilion, my husband leaned in. "Don't embarrass me," he whispered. "You're a wife, not an executive." I froze amidst the clinking flutes at the 10th anniversary gala for Halcyon Meridian. The company he paraded as his. What he didn't know was that the name Halcyon Meridian sat on the legal trademark filings next to my maiden name. This wasn't his coronation. It was the stage I'd set for his curtain call. My name is Evelyn Shaw, and for the last hour, I had been an exquisitely dressed ghost haunting the 10th anniversary gala of Halcyon Meridian. From the edge of the red carpet, a position of deliberate and calculated obscurity, I watched my husband's name, Grant Mercer, burn in 15-foot-high LED letters against the night sky of Greyhaven. His smile, a practiced masterpiece of warmth and ambition, flashed for every camera, a beacon of success he had manufactured from my marrow. The air inside the glasshouse pavilion was thick with the scent of money and lilies, a heady combination that clung to the humid West Arden evening. A jazz quartet played something smooth and forgettable in the corner, their notes weaving through the delicate chime of crystal flutes and the low, confident hum of investor chatter. It was a symphony of triumph, his triumph. As I stepped past the velvet rope, a young woman with a clipboard and an apologetic smile intercepted me. Her eyes scanned her list, flickered up to my face, and then down again, a flicker of pity in her gaze. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, her voice soft, as if breaking bad news. "The guest spouse's hospitality suite is to the left. We're keeping the main floor clear for executives and stakeholders." She pointed toward a curtained-off alcove where I could see the silhouettes of other well-dressed phantoms. Women tethered to power but not permitted to touch it. I was on the list, but in a column titled Non-Essential Personnel. My presence was a social requirement, my exclusion a professional one. Grant found me moments later, gliding through the crowd with the ease of a shark in its own aquarium. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, his knuckles brushing my arm in a gesture that looked like affection to anyone watching from a distance. Up close, it was a warning. He leaned in, his cologne a suffocating cloud. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet, the same voice that had once pitched visions of the future to me across our kitchen table. "Smile, look proud, but don't speak to the investors. Don't pitch any ideas. Tonight is about precision. Don't embarrass me. You're a wife, not an executive." He pulled back, that camera-ready smile snapping back into place, and left me standing there, the echo of his words colder than the ice in my untouched gin and tonic. My embarrassment wasn't the variable he needed to worry about tonight. My eyes scanned the room, a landscape I knew better than he ever could. I saw the investors he was courting, the journalists he was charming, and then I saw her, Marina Pike, the new chief operating officer. She was standing beside him, a sleek raven in a black sequined dress, her manicured hand resting on the sleeve of his tuxedo jacket. It wasn't a casual touch. It was an anchor, a statement of ownership. The way she laughed at something he said, tilting her head back just so. The way he looked down at her. It wasn't a secret. It was a press release. Rumors of their late-night strategy sessions had been circulating for months, as persistent and chilling as the draft from a poorly sealed window. Seeing them together now, under the brilliant glare of his success, felt less like a betrayal and more like a confirmation of data I had already processed. I turned away, my gaze falling upon the Wall of Honor, an enormous backlit installation dominating the far side of the pavilion. It showcased 10 golden milestones of Halcyon Meridian's first decade. I walked towards it, my heels sinking almost imperceptibly into the plush carpet. My reflection was a watery silhouette on the polished black marble as I scanned the engraved brass plates. Milestone 3. Secured Series A funding. I remembered drafting that pitch deck at 3 a.m., fueled by coffee and the naive belief that we were building this together. Milestone 7. Landed the AeroCorp logistics contract. My risk analysis model had won them that deal. Then my eyes locked on the first and most important plaque. Milestone 1. Inception of the AstraTrack logistics algorithm, the foundational patent, the very soul of the company, the code I had written in my small apartment years before I even met Grant, a legacy project from my time at my uncle's shuttered tech firm, Veil Systems. The creator's name was engraved in elegant, unforgiving script. Grant Mercer and the founding team. My name was gone. Erased. Replaced by a fiction he had told so many times he now believed it himself. I reached out and let my fingertips ghost over the cold, unfeeling metal. I felt no sorrow, no sting of tears, just the quiet, final click of a lock falling into place. My hand drifted to the thick, ceremonial ribbon of deep blue satin stretched before the wall, waiting to be cut by Grant to symbolize the start of the next decade. I brushed my fingers against it. It wasn't a ribbon, it was a tripwire. A soft vibration came from the small, beaded clutch in my hand. I angled myself away from the crowd, shielding the screen with my body. The message was from a secure, encrypted app. Asset is in position, ready to execute the covenant clause on your signal. It was from the legal entity representing the holding company that now owned a controlling stake in Halcyon Meridian's primary debt. My holding company. My fingers, steady and sure, typed a reply. Proceed as scheduled. Await final confirmation. I slipped the phone back into my purse and surveyed the room once more. My gaze settled on the head table, a long, imposing banquet table on a raised dais. Grant's seat was at the center. Marina's was to his right, and there, near the end, was a place setting left conspicuously empty, the small, tented place card before it was flipped face down, a gesture of casual, thoughtless dismissal. But I knew what name was printed on it, the name he had tried so hard to bury under his own. Evelyn Vale, my maiden name, the name under which the original patents for AstraTrack were filed, the name of the founding advisor he had forgotten he had. The jazz quartet faded out, and the evening's MC, a local news anchor with a blindingly white smile, took the stage. But before he could speak, Marina Pike stood up, raising her glass. The room quieted. "A toast," she declared, her voice ringing with a victor's confidence. "To a future of flawless execution, to Halcyon Meridian, a company with zero margin for error." A few people around me murmured their assent. I allowed myself a small, tight smile that no one else could see. "The margin for error," I whispered to my reflection in a nearby champagne bucket, "is tonight." The MC began his speech, his voice booming through the speakers. "And now, it is with great pleasure that we welcome the representatives from the North Atlantic Fund and Silvercrest Capital, whose recent injections of capital will power Halcyon into the next decade." Applause rippled through the pavilion. This was the crescendo Grant had orchestrated, the public validation of his genius. Under the cover of the noise, I reached into my clutch and retrieved a slim, hard-sided document case. It was lined with black velvet, cool and smooth to the touch. I unsnapped the silver clasp. The sound was almost silent, lost in the applause, but to me, it was as loud as a gunshot. Inside, nestled in the velvet, were 2 stacks of paper, bound and sealed with the red wax seal of the county court. One was a cease and desist order for trademark infringement. The other was an emergency notice of default and asset seizure. The show was over. My curtain was about to rise. The click of the latch on my document case was a definitive, final sound, cutting through the ambient celebration. As the MC droned on about synergy and fourth quarter projections, my mind unspooled, rewinding past the years of polished lies to the day it all began. We hadn't met at a gala like this. There was no crystal, no jazz, just the stale air of a rented conference room and the bitter smell of burnt coffee. Grant Mercer was pitching for seed funding, a whirlwind of charisma in a suit that was slightly too big for him. He was a storyteller, a weaver of grand narratives. He spoke of revolutionizing the logistics industry with nothing more than a PowerPoint deck and a voice that could sell sand in a desert. I was there as a freelance compliance consultant, hired by the angel investors to perform due diligence. My job was to find the flaws in the story. The irony was that the story's greatest strength was sitting right next to me, buried in my own code. I saw the potential not in him, but in the problem he was trying to solve, a problem I had already solved with AstraTrack. He was the dazzling performer. I was the quiet architect holding the blueprints. He needed my substance, and I, foolishly, thought I needed his spotlight. Our romance was a whirlwind, a merger of his ambition and my intellect. The prenuptial agreement was his idea. He'd brought it up over dinner at a chic restaurant, framing it as a testament to our modern partnership. "It protects both of us, Ev," he'd said, squeezing my hand over the table. "It keeps everything clean, proves we're in this for love, not for the business." He was so confident in his future success, so certain that his name would be the only one on the letterhead, that he barely glanced at the document my lawyer prepared. He signed his pages, his signature a bold, arrogant slash. He never bothered to read the fine print of Addendum B, Section 4, a clause I had insisted upon, which explicitly stipulated that all intellectual property developed and owned by either party prior to the marriage would remain the sole, unassailable property of that individual, regardless of its application or integration into any future shared ventures. He was protecting his future millions, never imagining I had already secured my own legacy. In those early years, our small apartment was the company's real headquarters. The boardroom was our kitchen table, while Grant was out charming investors and networking until dawn. I was the one at home, bathed in the blue light of my laptop screen at 2 a.m. I was the one architecting the business processes, designing the user interface, and stress testing the database. The entire operational framework of Halcyon Meridian was born on a stack of legal pads, fueled by cheap takeout and the fading hope that he saw me as his partner. He would come home, kiss my forehead, glance at the complex flowcharts I'd taped to the wall, and say, "Incredible work, honey. We're going to change the world." The pronoun was the first thing to go. In private, it was always we. We landed the first client. We debugged the system. We survived the first year, but then the first magazine feature was published. I remember seeing the glossy photo of him, leaning against a server rack, under the headline, "The Man Who Reinvented Logistics." I read the article, my stomach tightening with each paragraph. He spoke of the sleepless nights, the flash of inspiration, the grueling work. He used the word "I" 17 times. The word "we" appeared once, in reference to him and his investors. When I questioned him, he'd waved it away. "It's just PR, Ev. It's about building a brand, a personality. They need a single, strong face for the company." It was then I realized I wasn't his partner. I was his ghostwriter. Marina's arrival was the next milestone in my erasure. Grant introduced her as a top-tier operations expert, brought in to professionalize our workflow. She was sharp, efficient, and had a way of looking at me as if I were a piece of outdated furniture. The late-night meetings started almost immediately. "Just hammering out the Q3 strategy," he'd say, the whispers in the office, the sympathetic glances from the few junior engineers who remembered my early contributions, were like a cold draft. I was a relic from the startup phase, a part of the origin story that was being actively edited out. The final wall came down a year ago. I tried to log into the company's internal server to access some old project files and was met with a stark, red banner. "Access denied." When I called the IT department, a nervous tech explained that my administrative account, the one I had created on day 1, had been deactivated. "Per the new security protocol from the COO's office," he'd stammered. Grant's explanation was smoother and infinitely more cruel. He found me in the study, his expression a mask of patient condescension. "Honey, we're handling sensitive investor data now. We have to tighten the circle. It's a liability issue." He put his hands on my shoulders. "Your place is here, at home, away from all that pressure. You don't need to worry about it anymore." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply nodded. I went to my desk, opened my personal ledger, and under a list of Halcyon's outstanding bond and debt schedules, I wrote down his exact words. Your place is at home, away from the pressure. His dismissal wasn't just an insult. It was a tactical error. He thought he was confining me, but he was merely giving me the time and privacy to study his vulnerabilities. The pain didn't break me. It didn't make me softer or weaker. It made me methodical. It taught me how to read financial statements like poetry and understand that the truest power in any corporation isn't in the CEO's chair, but in the hands of the person who holds the debt. So, I learned how to buy it. Through a series of discrete transactions and a shell corporation I named Hearthline Holdings, a quiet nod to the home he'd exiled me to, I began acquiring Halcyon Meridian's distressed debt from its secondary lenders. Grant, in his aggressive push for growth, had over-leveraged the company, using risky margin loans with strict performance covenants tied to revenue. He was so focused on the top line that he never paid attention to the fine print on the debt agreements, just as he'd never paid attention to the addendum in our prenup. My silence over the past year wasn't the silence of a wounded wife. It was the calculated quiet of a brand strategist preparing for a hostile takeover. I watched him parade my work as his own, watched him dilute my legacy, all while I was becoming his single largest creditor. He saw a complacent spouse. The market saw an anonymous, aggressive investor, while he was basking in the spotlight of this gala. I was simply performing my final market assessment before the product launch. Standing there in the glasshouse pavilion, surrounded by the glittering monuments to his alleged success, I felt a strange sense of peace. The love, which had already been dying a slow death, was now officially gone. It had been a casualty of the merger, written off as an intangible asset with no book value. But the law is not intangible. A contract is not an emotion. A patent is a fact. A debt covenant is a promise backed by ruin. Our marriage was a failed enterprise, but a contract. I reminded myself as my fingers tightened on the velvet case. A contract lives forever. Grant saw Halcyon Meridian as a monument he had built. He looked at the gleaming glass pavilion, the well-dressed crowd, the glowing LED sign, and saw the fruits of his labor. He was a man who understood surfaces. What he never understood was the foundation, the invisible structure holding the entire edifice up. He thought the company was built on his charisma and venture capital. He was wrong. Halcyon Meridian is built on a single, vital piece of intellectual property, the AstraTrack routing algorithm, and AstraTrack was mine. It wasn't something I'd created in our shared apartment. Its genesis predated him by years. It was born at Veil Systems, a small, ambitious tech firm run by my uncle. I was Evelyn Veil then, a junior programmer with a knack for predictive data modeling. AstraTrack was my passion project, a dynamic, real-time logistics algorithm that could reroute shipping fleets based on hundreds of variables: weather, traffic, fuel consumption, port congestion. It was elegant, efficient, and years ahead of its time. When my uncle's health failed and Veil Systems had to be wound down, the assets were liquidated, but as part of my severance, I was legally transferred the priority rights to a portfolio of intangible assets, including the core patents and trademarks associated with the AstraTrack project. The transfer documents were signed, notarized, and filed away long before Grant Mercer ever bought me my first drink. My ownership was a matter of public record, hidden in plain sight under a name he had worked so hard to make me forget. When I showed Grant the early framework, he called it brilliant. Then, he called it a concept. When he incorporated it as the engine for Halcyon Meridian, he called it an inspiration for the public and for the investors. He called it a complete, from-the-ground-up re-innovation. That was his genius. Not creation, but appropriation. He took my architecture, commissioned his own programmers to build a new facade on top of it, and then changed the name on the blueprints. The core logic, the mathematical soul of the system, remained identical. It was a derivative work, and a flagrant one at that. His most critical mistake came during the Series A funding round. The investors' due diligence team insisted that the company secure a formal licensing agreement for the foundational routing technology it was based on, to insulate them from any potential future claims. Grant, needing to create the illusion of a clean third-party transaction, was directed by a friendly advisor to a small, discrete IP holding company based in Delaware called Northlight Digital Assets. He saw it as a simple, elegant solution to a paperwork problem. He signed a multi-year, multi-million-dollar licensing agreement with Northlight, paying them a handsome annual fee for the right to use what he claimed to have invented. He was so blinded by his own narrative, so eager to close the funding round, that he never bothered to investigate who actually owned Northlight Digital Assets. I did. I had incorporated it myself 6 months earlier. For 3 years, Grant had been unknowingly and meticulously paying me licensing fees to use my own stolen algorithm. Each payment was a legally binding affirmation of my ownership. But the algorithm was only the beginning of his oversight. He thought he owned the brand, but he only understood branding as logos and letterhead. 2 years ago, I began quietly filing for and renewing the Halcyon Meridian trademark under my name, Evelyn Vale, across a broad spectrum of international classifications. He had secured the name for data processing services. I, however, secured it for logistical software, business consulting, fleet management hardware, and cloud computing services. He had built a house on a small plot of land, not realizing I owned all the surrounding territory and the access roads. His grand presentations, the ones where he showcased the sleek user interface of the Halcyon platform, were my greatest source of evidence. A year ago, I filed for trade dress protection on the key screens of the user interface, the unique combination of colors, icons, and layout that made the platform distinctive. Every time he stood on a stage and used that interface in a product demo, he was violating my protected trade dress, and I documented every single instance. I kept a digital journal, a meticulous log with dates, times, locations, and screenshots of every presentation, every marketing brochure, every investor deck. Each entry was time-stamped and digitally notarized, creating an unassailable mountain of evidence of his continuous infringement. This was the fundamental difference between us. Grant thought of assets in terms of things he could see and touch. The servers in the climate-controlled data center, the ergonomic chairs in the new office, the company cars. He believed power was tangible. I knew that true. Unshakable power is invisible. It lives in the quiet, binding clauses of a contract, in the legal force of a registered trademark, in the unarguable authority of a signed signature on a deed of ownership. He saw a company. I saw a web of legal obligations and liabilities that he had blundered into, completely unaware. Marina was no different. Her vision was just as limited. For her. Operations meant optimizing workflows, scheduling meetings, and managing human resources. She prided herself on efficiency, on her ability to make the corporate machine run smoothly. My definition of operations was different. For the past year, my operational planning has involved retaining top-tier auditors to identify covenant breaches in Halcyon's loan agreements, mapping out the legal process for asset seizure, and preparing the exact documents currently resting in my lap. She was focused on keeping the trains running on time. I was focused on the fact that I owned the railroad, the stations, and the trains themselves. They worked so hard to steal the spotlight, to push me into the shadows so they could stand in the warm, adoring glow of public acclaim. It never occurred to either of them to check the building's electrical room. It never occurred to them to ask who paid the utility bill, who held the master key, and whose hand was resting, even now, on the main power switch. They were the stars of the show, but they had forgotten the show could only go on as long as I allowed it. The MC on stage was now proposing a toast to Halcyon Meridian's unprecedented revenue growth. A wave of applause echoed under the glass dome. Grant raised his champagne flute, a king acknowledging his court. The irony was so thick I could taste it, a bitter, metallic tang beneath the sweetness of the surrounding champagne. The very revenue they were celebrating was the anchor I had tied to his feet, and I was about to kick him into the deep. Grant's ambition had always outpaced his caution, especially when it came to financing, to fund his last aggressive expansion. He hadn't gone to his usual equity partners. He had taken on debt, a significant margin loan from a private lender called Argonaut Credit. Argonaut was known for offering large sums quickly, but their terms were notoriously strict. I had read the loan agreement 100 times, its dense pages of legalese becoming as familiar as a favorite novel. Buried in the 12th addendum was the covenant. Halcyon Meridian was required to maintain a specific EBITDA to revenue ratio, to be reported quarterly. It was a standard clause, but with Argonaut, the leash was brutally short. If the ratio slipped by even a fraction of a percent, it triggered punitive interest rates. If it slipped further, it triggered a default. This last quarter, I knew they were in trouble. Their growth had stalled, and their operating costs had skyrocketed. Grant and Marina had become desperate. Their solution was a piece of creative, and ultimately fraudulent. Accounting. A revenue sale leaseback. It was a complex scheme, but the principle was simple. They sold their future, contracted revenue, accounts receivable, to a third party for an immediate cash injection, which they then booked as current quarter earnings. This artificially inflated their revenue numbers just enough to meet the covenant. It was a house of cards, designed to withstand one light breeze, just long enough to get them through this gala and the next funding announcement. They were counting on no one looking too closely, but I was, and I had found the flaw in their fortress. A flaw not in their accounting, but in their original loan agreement with Argonaut. Tucked away in a subclause on page 87 was the provision I'd built my entire strategy on. It stated that in the event of syndication, Argonaut Credit had the right to sell portions of the debt to third-party entities without the requirement to notify the original debtor. It was a small, easily missed detail. A courtesy waived in the name of expediency. To Grant, it was just boilerplate. To me, it was a key. That was when Hearthline Holdings was born. My quiet, unassuming shell corporation began buying Halcyon's debt from Argonaut's secondary partners, piece by piece, transaction by transaction. I acquired it. Argonaut, seeing a chance to offload a potentially risky loan at a slight discount, was more than happy to sell. Within 6 months, Hearthline Holdings, my instrument of vengeance, became the majority owner of Halcyon Meridian's senior secured debt. Holding a controlling 51%, Grant was still sending his interest payments to Argonaut, completely oblivious that the majority of that money was now being funneled directly to me. The covenant they had just so cleverly met was the tripwire, but according to the terms I now controlled, a fraudulent report was an immediate and catastrophic breach. The sale-leaseback was their fatal error. I hired a forensic accounting firm, one of the best in the country, to audit the public filings. It took them less than a week to find the glaring flaw in the scheme. In their desperation to make the numbers work, Marina's team had counted the same revenue twice, once as the initial sale, and then again as a projected asset on their balance sheet. It was a classic double count, an amateur mistake born of arrogance and panic. This wasn't just a breach of the covenant. It was certifiable wire and securities fraud. The final piece of confirmation I needed came not from my own efforts, but from a gift of corporate carelessness. A week ago, a mid-level finance employee, fearing the company was about to implode and looking to secure a whistleblower payout, leaked a chain of internal emails to a financial journalist. The journalist, a contact I had cultivated, forwarded me the key email. It was from Marina to her CFO, sent 2 days before the quarterly report was filed. Her directive was short and damning. I don't care if it's held together with tape and wishes. Just book whatever you have to. We just need to get through the gala. They weren't just breaking the rules. They knew they were breaking them. They were gambling everything on this single night, hoping the glamour and the announcement of new funding would mask the rot within. And so, my own stage was set. Weeks ago, I had a process server put on retainer. He is here tonight, a nondescript man in a well-fitting suit, currently enjoying a crab cake near the main entrance. He isn't admiring the decor. He is waiting for a text from me, a signal to walk up to Grant Mercer in the middle of his celebration and hand him a formal, non-negotiable notice of covenant breach and demand for immediate repayment. That notice is only one of the weapons in my arsenal. The other rests in my clutch, inside the velvet-lined case. It's a temporary restraining order, granted this morning by a federal judge. It legally prohibits Halcyon Meridian from using the name, logo, or any associated intellectual property of which Evelyn Vale is the registered owner. Pending a full hearing, this single document will invalidate every banner, every screen, every piece of marketing in this entire pavilion. My preparations didn't stop there. I knew that once the chaos began, Grant would rely on the event's security to control the situation, to escort me out, to silence the disruption. He would be mistaken. Hearthline Holdings, as a major creditor anticipating a significant asset recovery operation, had contracted its own security detail. They are court-approved officers, licensed for private corporate engagements. There are 4 of them here tonight. You wouldn't notice them. One is dressed as an event waiter, another is by the sound booth, wearing the same black polo shirt as the tech crew. 2 more are near the exits. They all wear discreet black earpieces, listening on a channel that is not connected to the main event staff. They are not here to protect Grant. They are here to enforce a court order and protect me. Everyone here tonight thinks I am a silent accessory, a wife brought along to applaud her husband's success. They see a woman on the periphery, a decorative object. They could not be more wrong. I didn't come here to watch my husband take a victory lap. I came to foreclose on a decade of lies. I came to turn off the lights. The engine of my plan was not the public spectacle I was about to unleash, but the silent, surgical maneuver that had to happen first. While Grant was still basking in the glow of the stage lights, a discreet text from my phone had gone out to the 7 members of the Halcyon Meridian Board of Directors. It was a summons, citing Article 3, Section 7 of the Corporate Bylaws, for an emergency meeting to address a matter of extraordinary and time-sensitive material risk to the company. The meeting location was not a boardroom, but the green room, a sterile, temporary office set up behind the main stage, its thin walls doing little to muffle the sounds of the party they had just been ordered to leave. I was there first, standing beside the cheap conference table as they filed in. Their faces a mixture of confusion and irritation. The board was a carefully constructed ecosystem of Grant's loyalties. He held 2 seats himself. A third was held by Marina, a proxy vote granted to her as COO. 3 more belonged to the venture funds that had fueled their growth. Men in identical gray suits who viewed the company not as a living entity, but as a line item on a spreadsheet. And then there was the 7th seat, the one designated independent, Sybil Crane. Sybil was the key, a veteran of the tech industry with a reputation for incisive, no-nonsense governance. She was the only one on the board Grant hadn't personally selected. In fact, he had actively tried to block her appointment, years ago. During the Series A funding round, Sybil had been a partner at a fund Grant was pitching. She had questioned his revenue projections, calling them fantastical. Grant, his ego bruised, had labeled her as lacking vision and successfully lobbied to have her fund excluded from the deal. The irony was that the board, seeking to placate regulators with a truly independent voice, had brought her on 2 years later. Grant had been furious, but outvoted. He had made an enemy of the one person on his board whose vote was not already bought and paid for. I had met with Sybil a week ago, not in an office, but on a park bench overlooking the Greyhaven Marina. I didn't appeal to her history with Grant, or any desire for revenge. Sybil was a creature of logic and law, so I gave her both. I didn't ask for her support. I presented her with a condensed, undeniable file of facts. I showed her the loan agreement with Argonaut Credit, the fraudulent accounting of the sale-leaseback, and the pre-filed copy of the trademark infringement lawsuit under the name Evelyn Vale. I laid out the inevitable conclusion that the company was on the verge of a catastrophic, simultaneous implosion from both its largest creditor and the owner of its core intellectual property. I explained that to continue to support Grant and Marina in light of this information would be a gross violation of her fiduciary duty to the company's shareholders. I wasn't asking her to side with me. I was advising her to protect herself. Now, as she entered the green room, her eyes met mine. There was no warmth, just a cool, appraising understanding. The three VCs, Arthur Vance, Ben Carter, and Michael Wu, huddled together, whispering angrily. Grant and Marina burst in last, Grant's face flushed with fury. "What is the meaning of this, Evelyn?" he boomed. "Pulling this stunt in the middle of my gala?" I didn't answer him. I looked to Sybil. "As the independent director, I believe you should chair this emergency session. Ms. Crane." Sybil nodded, taking the seat at the head of the table. "This meeting is now in session," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mrs. Shaw has invoked the Extraordinary Circumstances Clause. According to the bylaws, this is a legal session. Let's hear it." I didn't give a speech. I simply placed 7 identical black folders on the table. "In your folders," I began, my voice even and calm, "you will find 3 documents. The first is a notice of default from Hearthline Holdings, the majority owner of this company's senior secured debt, citing fraudulent reporting. The second is a temporary restraining order, effective immediately, barring Halcyon Meridian from the use of its own name and core technology, due to a trademark and patent dispute filed by the legal owner, Evelyn Vale. The third is the leaked email from Ms. Pike, ordering her CFO to falsify documents to get through the gala." A heavy silence fell as they opened the folders. The rustle of paper was the only sound. I watched the blood drain from the faces of the 3 VCs as they absorbed the reality. Their 9-figure investment was, in an instant, worthless. The paper value of their shares was evaporating in this small, airless room. Arthur Vance spoke first, his voice a choked whisper. "Default? IP seizure? This will wipe us out. The company will be bankrupt by morning." "Correct," I said. "If the debt is called, Hearthline Holdings will seize all assets, including the servers, the client contracts, and the bank accounts, simultaneously. The lawsuit will freeze all operations. The company, as you know it, will cease to exist at market open tomorrow." "This is insane," Marina sputtered, looking at Grant for support. "This is a personal vendetta." I ignored her. I was speaking only to the people who mattered, the ones whose money was on the line. "However," I continued, "Hearthline is prepared to offer a lifeline. We are willing to extend emergency debtor-in-possession financing, effective immediately, enough to make payroll, maintain operations, and prevent a panic among your clients." The VCs looked up, a flicker of hope in their eyes. Ben Carter leaned forward. "What are the terms?" "The terms are non-negotiable," I said flatly. "The DP financing is conditional upon the immediate removal of Grant Mercer as CEO and Marina Pike as COO, and from this board, effective as of this vote, a neutral third-party custodian, approved by Hearthline, will be appointed for a 30-day period to protect the assets and verify the company's financials." Grant slammed his hand on the table. "You can't do this! This is my company!" Sybil Crane fixed him with an icy stare. "It stopped being your company, Grant, the moment you committed securities fraud and breached your debt covenants." She turned her gaze to me. Her face was unreadable, a perfect mask of corporate neutrality. "And what if we refuse this offer, Mrs. Shaw? What if the board chooses to back Mr. Mercer?" This was the moment, the end game. I held her gaze. "Then I send one text message, and my lawyers flip the switch on the debt. Hearthline will trigger the acceleration clause. The entire loan becomes due, in full. By midnight tonight, the company is liquidated. You all get nothing. The choice is yours." 2 seconds of absolute silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating like a safety bar locking into place. In those 2 seconds, I could see the frantic calculations behind the VC's eyes as they weighed their loyalty to the man who had made them paper millions against the woman who was offering to save them from total ruin. Zibble broke the silence. We'll proceed with a vote on the motion to accept the DAP financing under the terms presented. Her eyes swept across the table. Given the circumstances, we'll make it a secret ballot. She slid a small stack of blank cards and a pen to the center of the table. Write yes or no. Fold it once. Slide it to me. Grant and Marina were frozen in disbelief. The VCs moved with grim purpose. 5 cards were slid across the polished table to Sybil. She unfolded them one by one, her expression unchanging. She looked up, her gaze finally settling on Marina. The vote is 3 in favor, 2 opposed, she announced, her voice flat. The motion carries. Mr. Mercer, Ms. Pike, you are hereby relieved of your duties. As she spoke, she reached out and gently tipped over the untouched red proxy card that had been placed in front of Marina's seat. It landed face down on the table with a soft, final click. The green room door closed with a soft click, sealing Grant and Marina in with the wreckage of their careers. I stepped back into the cacophony of the gala. The air was still electric, but now it felt like the charged, heavy atmosphere before a lightning strike. No one in the main hall knew what had just transpired in the small room behind the stage. To them, Grant Mercer was still the king in his castle. I saw him ascending the stage, bathed in a brilliant white spotlight, a conquering hero returning to his adoring public. The MC's voice boomed. Ladies and gentlemen, the man of the decade, the visionary founder and CEO of Halcyon Meridian, Mr. Grant Mercer. The applause was deafening. Grant soaked it in, his arms outstretched, that familiar, camera-perfect smile plastered on his face. He was a master of the stage, and this was his finest performance. He spoke of the future, of innovation, of a new era of logistical perfection. He was selling them a story I had written, and he was doing it from a stage I had paid for. And to mark the beginning of our next 10 years, he declared, his voice reaching a dramatic crescendo, we are proud to unveil a new look for a new era. I give you Halcyon Meridian 2.0. With a flourish, he pulled a velvet cord. A massive silk drape fell away from the enormous LED screen behind him, revealing the new logo. It was sleek, minimalist, and undeniably beautiful. A stylized blue falcon soaring over a golden meridian line. It was also the exact design depicted in the trade dress registration I had filed 8 months ago, a design he had praised as truly inspired when he'd seen it on my laptop and assumed it was for a freelance project. He had stolen it, just like he had stolen everything else. He stood there, silhouetted against my design, his arms raised in triumph. From my position near the sound booth, I caught the eye of the man I'd hired, the one posing as a tech supervisor. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the screen behind Grant flickered. The soaring falcon vanished. The screen went black, plunging the stage into a dramatic, momentary darkness. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Then, letters began to appear, typed out in a simple, stark white font against the black void. Each word landed with the finality of a court judgment. Notice of trademark and trade dress ownership, Halcyon Meridian and associated logos, branding and likeness, proprietor, Evelyn Vale. A wave of confused murmuring rippled through the pavilion. It started as a low hum and grew into a loud buzz, like 1,000 insects taking flight at once. I could see people pulling out their phones, pointing at the screen, then at me. My name, my real name, was up there in 15-foot letters, eclipsing my husband. Grant was frozen, his back to the audience, staring at the screen in utter disbelief. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. At that exact moment, my process server began to move. He walked with a calm, unhurried purpose, the crowd parting before him as if by instinct. He mounted the steps to the stage, approached my stunned husband, and said, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the growing din, Mr. Grant Mercer? He extended a large, sealed manila envelope. You've been served. Flashbulbs erupted from the press section, a volley of clicks and strobing lights capturing Grant's look of slack-jawed horror as he numbly took the envelope. The server presented a tablet. I need your signature here, sir. Marina, who had been watching from the front row, finally broke from her stupor. She saw me standing by the wall and stormed towards me, her face a contorted mask of rage. What is this? She hissed, her voice low and venomous. What did you do? Who in God's name do you think you are to— I cut her off. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I'm the person who owns the name of this party, I said, my voice as cold and clear as the ice in my drink. I turned from her and walked towards the secondary lectern at the side of the stage, the one reserved for the guest speakers. I picked up the microphone. The room fell into a tense, expectant silence. For the sake of clarity, I said, my amplified voice steady and firm, cutting through the confusion. Pursuant to a temporary restraining order, issued this morning by the U.S. District Court, a copy of which Mr. Mercer is now holding, Halcyon Meridian is hereby legally prohibited from the use of its registered name, its logos, and all associated marketing materials, effective immediately, pending the resolution of an intellectual property ownership dispute. The chaos that followed was quiet and swift. I saw the night's main sponsor, the chairman of a major investment bank, speaking urgently into his phone. He then gave the MC a sharp, frantic shake of his head. The MC, pale and sweating under the lights, stammered for a moment before making a panicked gesture to the jazz quartet. The band, confused, hesitantly struck up a tune, a surreal, upbeat melody that played over the silent, imploding disaster. I stood there for a moment, watching it all unfold. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't cried. I hadn't made a scene. My rage was not in my voice. It was in the documents. My fury was not in my fists. It was in the quiet, undeniable power of my signature on a piece of paper, a power he had never thought to look for. My gaze drifted back to Grant. He was still on stage, a pathetic figure under the glare of the lights, holding a legal document that had just invalidated his entire identity. He looked small, deflated. The spotlight that had once made him look like a giant now only served to illuminate how completely he had shrunk. It was a bloodless arm break, a clean, professional snap, but under the bright lights of his own gala, the heavy gold watch he wore so proudly, the one he always said was a symbol of his success, suddenly seemed loose on his wrist, as if the very bones beneath it had begun to dissolve. Arthur Vance, one of the VCs from the board meeting, pushed through the crowd toward me. His face was ashen. The abstract financial risk from the green room had just become a very public, very humiliating reality. This is a catastrophe, he whispered, his eyes wide. Who is in charge here? Who's running this company now? I turned to face him, allowing a small, calm smile to touch my lips for the first time all night. The answer was simple. It was the only answer that had ever mattered. The person whose name is on the paperwork. The party outside was over. The panicked jazz had faded. The confused chatter of the guests had dissipated, and the only sound that bled through the thin walls of the green room was the low, industrial hum of the pavilion's air conditioning. It was a cold, clean sound, the sound of a machine resetting. We were all back at the conference table, but the power dynamic had been irrevocably altered. Grant and Marina sat slumped in their chairs, stripped of their authority, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The three venture capitalists, Vance, Carter, and Wu, looked like men who had just survived a plane crash, shell-shocked and terrified. Sybil Crane sat at the head of the table, her expression as impassive as a judge's. I had made one phone call. A quiet, unassuming man in a gray suit now stood at a portable whiteboard at the end of the room. He was Mr. Davies, the lead forensic accountant I had retained months ago. He was not a dramatic man. He dealt in numbers, and tonight, his numbers were going to speak louder than any of Grant's speeches. The sale-leaseback transaction, as recorded in the Q3 financials, is problematic, Davies began, his voice dry and devoid of emotion. He uncapped a marker. Halcyon sold an asset, its future receivables, for an immediate cash payment of $42 million. This payment was booked as revenue. He drew a simple diagram. However, the company then listed the same future receivables as a performing asset on their balance sheet, valued at $55 million. You cannot sell a house and still list it in your real estate portfolio. This is a textbook double count. He continued, his marker squeaking on the board. Furthermore, we've identified approximately $26 million in operating expenditures, server leases, logistics contracts, and Q4 bonus provisions that were improperly deferred. They were pushed into the next fiscal quarter to artificially inflate the current quarter's EBITDA. The numbers submitted to your creditor were not just optimistic, they were a work of fiction. Marina, finding a last shred of defiance, spoke up, her voice raspy. This is standard industry practice, a bit of aggressive accounting to bridge a gap. Davies turned from the board and looked at her over the rim of his glasses. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Madam, aggressive accounting is what you do with tax deductions. What you did is a direct violation of GAAP and a material breach of your loan covenant with Argonaut Credit, and by extension, its primary holder, Hearthline Holdings. It isn't industry practice, it's the textbook definition of fraud. A thick silence settled over the room. The numbers on the board hung in the air. Unassailable. I let the weight of them sink in before I made my next move. I reached into my bag and placed a small, silver USB drive on the center of the table. It slid across the polished surface and stopped in front of Sybil. That is a complete, unalterable commit log from the source code of the AstraTrack algorithm, I said. It details every single line of code, every revision, and every annotation from its inception. I looked directly at Grant. The primary author, listed on over 90% of the core logic commits, is a user named E. Vale. Grant forced a laugh, a hollow, desperate sound. Evelyn and I worked on that together, in the early days. From our apartment, it was a collaboration. I didn't even blink. The date of the final core commit by E. Vale was May 14th, 2 years before you and I had our first date, I said, my voice cutting through his lie. On that day, you were submitting your final application for a seed funding round that was ultimately rejected. The collaboration was you seeing my work and deciding it was yours. The last bit of color drained from his face. He had no response. The story he had told himself for a decade had just been publicly dismantled by a timestamp. Arthur Vance, the lead VC, finally found his voice. He pushed his chair back and stood up, pointing a trembling finger at me. I've had enough of this. This is a domestic dispute. A divorce played out on a corporate stage. We are not in the business of financing your personal litigation. Mrs. Shaw. You're right, Mr. Vance, I said calmly, meeting his panicked gaze. You're in the business of protecting your investment, an investment that is currently worthless. Your CEO is a fraud. Your COO is his accomplice, and your company is illegally using intellectual property it doesn't own. You have two options. The first is to do nothing. In that case, Hearthline calls in the debt. The company is liquidated, and you walk away with pennies on the dollar after a protracted bankruptcy. The second option is a governance rescue. I let that phrase hang in the air. It sounded clean, professional, and, most importantly, profitable. I am proposing that the board ratify its earlier decision and formally install an interim management team. This team's mandate will be to stabilize operations, reassure clients, and cooperate fully with the auditors to produce a clean, accurate set of books. The intellectual property issue will be resolved by reverting the licenses to the legal owner, Evelyn Vale, under a temporary royalty-free agreement that will keep the platform running. This is not about tearing the company down. This is the only way to save it. Sybil Crane looked at Vance, then at the other VCs. You've heard the proposal, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. It appears to be the only viable path forward that doesn't result in a total loss of your capital. We will vote, now." She took out the same blank cards from before. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint whisper of the air conditioning as 7 slips of paper were passed around the table. I watched as each person bent over their card, their pens moving with grim finality. The cards were folded and slid back to the center of the table. The sound of the paper sliding across the glass was soft, but it felt as definitive as a key turning in a heavy lock. Sybil collected the 7 slips. She unfolded them one by one, her face giving nothing away. She stacked them neatly before speaking. "On the motion to formally remove Grant Mercer and Marina Pike, and to accept the terms of the governance rescue plan as outlined by Mrs. Shaw," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "The vote is 5 in favor, 2 opposed. Grant and Marina's votes for themselves, meaningless." "The motion carries," Sybil declared. "The decision is final." It was over. The fight was done. The great celebrated engine of Halcyon Meridian had sputtered to a halt. In the profound silence that followed, the music of the gala felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. All that was left was the cold, sterile, and perfectly clean hum of the air conditioner, washing over the ruins. Sybil Crane stacked the 7 folded ballots into a neat, precise pile, a small monument to the end of an era. She did not look at Grant or Marina. Her focus was entirely on the legal and procedural finality of the moment. She cleared her throat and read from the resolution that had been attached to the financing agreement, her voice slow and deliberate, each word falling into the quiet room with the weight of a gavel. "Be it resolved, that effective immediately, Grant Mercer and Marina Pike are removed from their positions as Chief Executive Officer and Chief Operating Officer, and from their seats on the Board of Directors. Their signing authorities are revoked. Their access to corporate accounts and systems is terminated. Be it further resolved that the Board appoints an interim Chief Executive Officer to serve for a period of no less than 90 days, with the full authority of the office. The interim CEO is—" Sybil paused, her eyes lifting to meet mine. "Evelyn Vale, also known as Evelyn Shaw." The name, my name, hung in the air. For years, Evelyn Shaw had been a name of quiet compromise, a name associated with the silent partnership and the slow erasure. Evelyn Vale was a name of creation, the name signed on patents and legal deeds. Hearing it spoken aloud in this room was like breathing my own air again after a decade of suffocation. Before anyone else could speak, Sybil slid a document across the table toward me. It was the debtor-in-possession financing agreement from Hearthline Holdings. My first act under my own name was to save the company from the debt I had used to condemn it. I picked up the fountain pen I had brought with me, a heavy old pen that had belonged to my uncle. The nib scratched softly against the thick paper as I signed Evelyn Vale on the signature line. With that single stroke of ink, the company now had 90 days of oxygen, 90 days to live. I looked up from the paper. "Arthur," I said, my voice calm and even, addressing the lead VC. "I need you to call your head of IT, right now. I want all administrative access for Mercer and Pike revoked. Then, I want you to give the tech team a single directive. Begin the process of reverting all core software licenses and cloud service authentications to the registered IP holder, Evelyn Vale. I have a team standing by to assist. Tell them to assure their staff that this is a change in leadership, not a change in employment. No one is being laid off tonight." Arthur, looking like a man just pulled from a frozen lake, fumbled for his phone and scurried out of the room, already barking orders. My focus shifted. I pulled out my own phone, opened the company-wide secure messaging app I still had access to, and navigated to the all-staff channel. My fingers moved quickly across the screen, composing the first official communication of the new regime. "This is Evelyn Vale, your interim CEO. There will be many questions, and we will answer them in due course. For tonight, know this: there will be no witch hunts. Our problems are in the ledger, not in the code. Our job is to fix the books and ship product. More to come in the morning. Get some rest." I hit send. The message was delivered to hundreds of employees. a small beacon of stability in what was about to be a hurricane of news and speculation. Marina, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally moved. She snatched her phone from the table, her thumb flying across the screen. I saw the names in her recent contacts. She was trying to rally her loyalists, to sow chaos. Before she could hit send, one of my security officers, the one who had been posing as a waiter, stepped forward. He was polite, but his presence was an immovable wall. "Ms. Pike," he said, his voice soft but firm. "This meeting is concluded. I'll be happy to escort you from the premises." He gestured toward the door. Her attempt to wield her old power had been neutralized before it could even begin. She looked at him, then at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. She said nothing. She simply stood, gathered her purse, and allowed herself to be led away. Grant was a different story. As Marina was being escorted out one door, he seemed to be looking for another. A camera, a journalist, an audience. The PR smile. The weapon he had wielded his entire career flickered on his face. It was a ghost of a smile, a desperate, reflexive gesture. But the cameras that had once adored him were gone. The reporters were outside, frantically typing up the story of the public implosion, the story of the name Evelyn Vale on the screen. His performance was over, and the theater was empty. He was no longer the story. I ignored him. My priority was not the past, but the present. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed the private number for the CEO of AeroCorp, our largest and most important client. He picked up on the second ring, his voice wary. He had clearly already heard the rumors. "Marcus, it's Evelyn Vale," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I know you're hearing a lot of noise right now. I'm calling to tell you that I am the new interim CEO of Halcyon Meridian. More importantly, I'm calling to tell you that your service level agreement is, and will remain, our highest priority. The platform is stable. The team is in place. You will experience no disruption. I am personally guaranteeing it." I spent the next 10 minutes walking him through the stability plan, answering his sharp questions with direct, honest answers. I promised a full report on his desk by 7 a.m. By the end of the call, I had pulled our most important relationship back from the brink. As I hung up, I immediately began drafting a similar open letter to all our clients. A letter I would sign, for the first time in a decade, with my own name. The backdrop behind the now empty stage still bore the faint ghost image of the Halcyon 2.0 logo. The lights having been dimmed, my eyes, and the metaphorical camera of my memory, blurred it out of focus. The only thing that felt sharp and real was the solid weight of my uncle's fountain pen in my hand. It felt less like a writing instrument and more like a tool, a lever that had just moved the world. And then, Grant's voice from what felt like a lifetime ago echoed in my mind. That sharp, condescending whisper in the middle of the party he thought was his. "You don't belong at the company." He was right. I didn't belong in his company. The fraudulent, hollow thing he had built on my foundations, I belonged in mine. I stood up and walked towards the reflective glass wall of the green room, which looked out on the now dark and empty gala floor. I saw a woman's silhouette, and for a moment, she was a stranger. Then she came into focus. It was me. And I could almost see the name hovering there in the reflection, superimposed over my own image, not in giant LED letters, but in the quiet, unshakable script of a legal document. Evelyn Vale. It was there. It was sharp, and it was silent. The air in the green room was stale with the ghost of a dead-ended argument, leaving Grant to stare at the wall, a deposed king in a room without a throne. I turned and walked back toward the main pavilion. The scene was one of arrested decay. The gala had died, but no one had yet cleared the body. Champagne flutes stood half full on abandoned tables. A string quartet, hired for the post-speech reception, sat awkwardly in their chairs, instruments silent. What remained of the crowd was a tight, predatory cluster of journalists, photographers, and the most tenacious of the investors. all gathered near the stage, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. They smelled blood in the water, and they were waiting for the shark to reveal itself. My security detail, now operating openly, moved with me. They didn't push or shove. Their quiet, professional presence was enough to make a path for me through the knot of people. All eyes followed me as I walked not to a waiting car, but directly to the stage lectern. It was the same one Grant had stood behind less than an hour ago, his voice full of false promises. When I placed my hands on its polished wood surface, it was still warm. I adjusted the microphone, the small squeak of feedback it emitted, silencing the remaining whispers in the room. Every phone, every camera, every eye was on me. They were expecting a spectacle, a tearful wife, a spurned partner, a dramatic accusation. I was about to give them something far more unsettling, a press release. "Good evening," I began, my voice amplified in the cavernous, quiet space. It was steady. It was cold. "I have a brief statement." I paused, letting the silence stretch. I made eye contact with a well-known reporter from the Wall Street Journal in the front row. I wanted them to record every word, not as an emotional outburst, but as a formal declaration. As of 9:17 p.m. this evening, Halcyon Meridian has entered a state of managed asset preservation and operational continuity. I used the language of corporate filings, of SEC reports. There was no sentiment, no color, just the stark, irrefutable language of legal and financial reality. I could see the journalists frowning, their fingers flying across their keyboards to look up the precise meaning of the terms. They were expecting a story about a marriage. I was giving them a story about a Chapter 11 restructuring, executed without a judge. "The board of directors," I continued, "after reviewing evidence of significant financial and intellectual property irregularities, has unanimously voted for an immediate change in executive leadership." I chose the word unanimously, deliberately. The 5-2 vote was legally a majority, but in the public record, it would be remembered as a unified front. The VCs would not dare contradict it. Their survival now depended on their alignment with me. "We are cooperating fully with an independent auditing firm to clarify the company's financial position." I let that sink in. Irregularities. Independent auditing firm. These were the coded phrases that sent stock prices plummeting and launched federal investigations. I was not accusing anyone of a crime. I was merely stating that a crime scene was being professionally examined. "To our clients and partners," I said, shifting my tone from procedural to declarative, "there will be no interruption of service. The platform is secure. The technology is stable. Your service level agreements are our highest priority, and all contracts will be honored without exception. The company's ability to deliver is not, and has never been, in question." Throughout the statement, I never once mentioned the names Grant Mercer or Marina Pike. Their names were a part of the disease, not the cure. To speak their names now would be to grant them a role in the company's future, even as villains. My silence was more potent. It rendered them footnotes. It transformed them from executives into the irregularities the auditors were investigating. They were no longer people. They were a problem that had been solved. I signaled I was finished by taking a small step back from the microphone. A barrage of questions erupted at once, a wall of noise. "What is the nature of the irregularities? Will the SEC be involved? Are you leading a hostile takeover?" I held up a hand, and surprisingly, the room quieted. I scanned the faces and pointed to a young, sharp-eyed reporter in the third row. She had been asking the most intelligent question all night, not with her voice, but with her intense, analytical gaze. "Ma'am," she called out, her voice clear and distinct, "you weren't on the program tonight. You were not listed as a board member or an executive. For everyone here who is just learning your name, who are you in this story?" It was the perfect question. It wasn't about the money or the scandal. It was about my identity, my very right to be standing there. I leaned back into the microphone. "I'm the one who signs the electricity bills." A few confused, nervous laughs broke out in the crowd. They thought it was a joke, a deflection. Then, a sudden, profound silence fell as the true implication of the statement rippled through the room. It wasn't a joke. It was the bluntest possible definition of ownership. The person who signs the electricity bill is the one who keeps the lights on. The person who keeps the lights on is the one who owns the building. Everything else is just decoration. I let the silence sit for a moment longer before adding the final, decisive clause. As for anyone else who claims the title of founder, I said, my eyes sweeping the room, I would invite them, and you, to carefully review the public intellectual property filings at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. The historical record is quite clear. Before stepping away, I adjusted the lapel of my jacket, a small, deliberate movement, the bright, concentrated beam of a single spotlight, operated by one of my own men in the tech booth, narrowed and focused on the simple, newly pinned name tag on my chest. The camera zoomed in, capturing the clean, laser-engraved letters. Evelyn Vale, Interim CEO. Then I turned and walked away from the lectern. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. There was no triumphant smile, no wave to the cameras. I felt a strange, cold calm, the feeling of a complex and dangerous task brought to a clean, successful conclusion. It was like a surgeon leaving an operating room. The patient was stable. The cancer had been excised. There was no applause and no celebration. There was only the quiet, sterile satisfaction of a job well done. There was no blood on my hands, only ink. I didn't return to the gala floor. The victory was not in the public eye, but in the quiet, legal finality of what came next. Sybil Crane met me at the entrance to the green room, the same sterile space where the board had capitulated. On the cheap conference table, a laptop was open, and beside it, a single, one-page document, and my fountain pen were waiting. The room was now a makeshift command center, the air cleansed of its earlier panic, replaced by the quiet hum of focused work. This final document was not a complex contract. It was a simple directive of transfer, an instrument of reversion. It authorized the immediate and irrevocable transfer of the exclusive operating license for the AstraTrack algorithm and all its derivatives from the now-defunct shell company. Northlight Digital Assets, back to its original, registered owner, it was the last lock. I sat down, the cheap chair creaking under my weight. I uncapped the pen, its familiar heft a comforting anchor in the sudden quiet. There was no hesitation. My signature. Evelyn Vale flowed onto the page, the ink a dark, definitive black against the stark white of the paper. It was the same signature from a decade ago, the one on the original patent filings, the one he had tried to bury under a new name and a new life, but it had survived. It had waited. As my signature dried, the young paralegal I had hired, who had been waiting quietly in the corner, typed a final command into the laptop. He hit the enter key with a soft, decisive tap. On the screen was the company's internal asset management portal, a page that listed the ownership status of all key intellectual property. For 10 years, the line item for AstraTrack Core Logic had read, "Licensed from Northlight Digital Assets." Now, the screen refreshed, the old text vanished, replaced by a single, clean line. Ownership, Evelyn Vale. My pen was still resting on the paper. The final stroke of my name still drying. The ink set quickly into the thick, cotton rag paper, a permanent, unchangeable fact. It was done. All the anger, all the years of quiet planning, all the intricate legal maneuvering had distilled down to this one quiet moment, to a name on a screen and ink on a page. The victory wasn't a shout. It was a signature. Sybil Crane, who had been watching from across the table, extended her hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes clear. There was no pity in her expression, only a crisp, professional respect. "Welcome back where you belong, Ms. Vale," she said. From outside the room, the soundscape had changed. The panicked, chaotic energy had subsided. The event staff, on my orders, had instructed the string quartet to resume playing. but not the triumphant, bombastic pieces from earlier. Now, it was something quiet, something classical and understated. It wasn't the music of a celebration, it was the music of a transition, a low, steady hum of order being restored. The door to the room creaked open. Grant stood in the threshold, a silhouette against the dim light of the empty pavilion. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, bewildered emptiness. He looked like a man who had been woken from a long dream and could no longer recognize the room he was in. His mouth opened, as if to speak, to protest, to say my name, but no sound came out. One of the security officers stepped quietly into his line of sight, a polite but impassible presence. The officer didn't touch him, didn't threaten him. He simply stood, maintaining the new order through his calm, unwavering silence. Grant's moment to speak had passed. He was no longer a participant in these events. He was just a spectator. He closed his mouth, turned, and walked away into the darkness of his own ruined party. I turned back to the table. I picked up the original court order, the one my process server had handed to Grant on stage. I folded it precisely into thirds, the creases sharp and exact. I slipped it into a fresh manila envelope, the one with the bright red seal of the district court, a piece of the past, now neatly filed away. My final act was the simplest. I sat down at the laptop, which was now logged into the primary CEO email account. The old signature block, with Grant's name and title, was still there. I deleted it. I typed in my own. Then I composed a new message. The address was simple. To all staff at Halcyon Meridian, The subject line was just 2 words, the way forward. The body was the statement I had given to my largest client, a promise of stability and a commitment to the work ahead. I paused for a fraction of a second, my finger hovering over the mouse. Then, I clicked send. I stood up, picked up my clutch and the envelope, and walked to the door. Sybil held it open for me. As I stepped through, I pulled it closed behind me. The latch caught with a soft, final click. It was the sound of a door locking. It was the sound of a full stop. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me. I'd love to connect with all of you, so please comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from. Let's share our thoughts on the story together. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support it by hitting the hype button. Your support makes all of this possible.